This is a sufficient assumption question. We can tell because if we have the assumption, then the conclusion follows logically. So the assumption is literally sufficient to guarantee that we have a valid argument. It's got to guarantee our conclusion. So we want to find the conclusion and the premises and link them up with a linking assumption, and then state that linking assumption so strongly that it guarantees the conclusion. And we're on the hunt for conditional statements and repeating terms here. We often make a big conditional chain when we do sufficient assumption questions, and that's happening here. So our conclusion is after the thus, and it says actions that would be reasonably expected to leave aggregate well-being unchanged must also be right, or also right. And when they say also there, they're referring back to this other thing that is right, and so they mean morally right. And so we're going to talk about things that are unchanged in kind of a weird way, because some of the terms up here are about increasing aggregate well-being or reducing aggregate well-being. And so if it leaves aggregate well-being unchanged, that means it doesn't do either of those things. So essentially our conclusion is saying if it's not reasonably expected to increase well-being, and it's not reasonably expected to reduce well-being, then it must be morally right. This is the whole idea of leaving aggregate well-being unchanged. Now the premises tell us that an action is morally right if it could be expected to increase well-being. So if is a sufficient indicator. If it's reasonably expected to increase well-being, it's morally right. The second premise tells us an action is morally wrong if and only if. That's why we got the double arrow there. That's what if and only if means. It's morally wrong if and only if it's reasonably expected to reduce well-being. And so what we typically do here on sufficient assumption questions is we separate these terms that we want to connect and we try to fit the premises in. We're trying to build a big chain to connect this idea to that idea, which will essentially guarantee our conclusion. So we want to start here. So if it's not reasonably expected to increase well-being and it's not reasonably expected to reduce well-being, what can we say about it? And then we want to land on the idea all the way over here that makes it morally right. So any terms that we have that we can attach to either of these, that's our first move. Now, in terms of getting premise number one involved, we can't attach it to this left-hand side because this is positive and we want it to be negative on the left. And so we can't just take the inverse of it. There's no way to attach this over here. We also can't attach this over here because we have to have something where we're expecting to leave well-being unchanged. And this is expecting it to increase. You can't have both of those in the chain. You can't expect it to be unchanged and also expect it to increase. So it's hard to imagine where premise number one is going to fit in here. So I would leave it alone for a second and focus on premise number two. Now, this term is positive on the right. I want it to be negative and on the left. So I could take the contrapositive of it. So if an action is not reasonably expected to reduce well-being, then it's not morally wrong. Right? And that's a double arrow technically, but I'm really interested in the one that goes from left to right here because I want to start here and then I can say, so if it just has, if one of these terms makes something happen, both of them make that thing happen. And I'm going to make a little point over here. This is sort of an interesting little side thing, but so if you want to guarantee that A and B produce C or are enough to imply C, knowing that B implies C is enough. If it's true that B implies C, then it's true that A and B together imply C. Now A is just kind of free riding, it's not really doing anything. B is doing all the work here, but this is enough to guarantee that. And something similar is happening over here. Just this term alone, the fact that you're not reducing well-being is enough to say that an action is not morally wrong. So this term, the fact that you're not increasing well-being, that's not really playing a role here. It's this term that gets you to the idea that an action isn't morally wrong, but there's still a gap here. If it's not morally wrong, then it's morally right. And so that's where we're expecting the answer choice to fill the gap. And if it does fill the gap, we're going to be in business. Let me show you. So I'll just draw the statement we're going to make. If it's not reasonably expected to reduce well-being, then it's not morally wrong, so it's morally right. Now, keep in mind, we don't have this yet. This is the assumption that I think the right answer is going to add. Now, and we're not using this term. So if an action is expected to leave well-being unchanged, if it's not going to change it at all, then it's not expected to reduce it. So we're not really using the fact that it's also not expected to increase it, right? Unchanged technically leads to both of these, but this one isn't doing any of the work. And the reason we know it's not doing any of the work is because we can't take the inverse of this first premise. There's no way to get this first premise involved in the chain. That's really the challenge of this question, is realizing that you're only going to use the second premise. And so if we add this idea to the second premise, that guarantees that an action that's expected to leave well-being unchanged is not expected to reduce well-being, right? Because if it's unchanged, it's not reducing, then it's not morally wrong, it must be morally right. If we add this to what we already have, we're going to guarantee our conclusion. So we would go hunting for this. Now, this is really hard to anticipate, but I also think that it's kind of equally hard to recognize in the answer choices if you haven't anticipated it. This is just kind of a tough question. So let's go ahead, and this is the assumption that we want to add to the contrapositive of the second premise, and that will guarantee the conclusion. Let's go ahead and check out the answer choice to see if we can find it. The filter question here is, if I add this to the premises, does it guarantee the conclusion? So answer choice A says only wrong actions would be reasonably expected to reduce the aggregate well-being. So only is a necessary indicator. So if it's reasonably expected to reduce well-being, then it's wrong. But that's actually something we kind of already have, right? That's if we recognize that this is a biconditional, that's the arrow that goes this way, right? If it's reasonably expected to reduce well-being, it's wrong. So we kind of already have answer choice A. And so one of the keys to guaranteeing the conclusion here is you're going to have to say something more than what you already have. You're going to have to add something to the argument. We already have the idea that A is expressing. It's embedded in this second premise. So B says no action is both right and wrong. So that means that if it's right, it's not wrong. If you can't be both, that means that if you're one, then you're not the other. And so we could do if it's morally right, then it's not morally wrong. The contrapositive is going to say if it's morally wrong, and get the M on the right side or on the correct side. If it's morally wrong, then it's not morally right. But this is actually like the inverse of what we're looking for. We're looking for if it's not one, then it's the other. Not the idea that you can't do both, but that you must do one. If you're not one, then the other. And that's a subtle difference, but it's a really important difference. And so B says you can't do both. Our assumption says you must do one. If you're not doing one, you're doing the other. And so that's why we're not into answer choice B. Answer choice C is the one that we want to like. If it's not morally wrong, then it's right. When you add that to the contrapositive of premise number 2, when something is leaving well-being unchanged, then it's not reasonably expected to reduce it. And that means so unchanged actions are not morally wrong. We just need to be able to get from not morally wrong to morally right. So C is the one you want to get into here. They're actions that would be expected to leave unchanged aggregate well-being. So that just says these exist, but it doesn't get to the idea that they're right? So that's not guaranteeing our conclusion, and that's the criteria for the right answer. Only right actions have good consequences, and good consequences is a brand new term that's not going to attach to anything in the passage. And so hopefully you don't find this one too appealing. That would be a good way out of it, is to say that it's just not going to attach to anything good. I don't know what to do with this good consequences thing. Yeah, I don't know if that's aggregate well-being or anything. That's just a brand new term. And so we're out on E. Plus answer choice C, when you add it to the contrapositive of the second premise, guarantees the conclusion. And that's what it takes to like an answer choice here.